Hey folks, you're very welcome back to another episode of the Meditations on Movement podcast. Today we are going to discuss a very interesting topic. Something that you've maybe considered before is conscious awareness when moving. So what do I mean by conscious awareness when moving? Basically the way I want you to think of this is, where is your focus when you're moving? What are you actually thinking about? Where are you directing things? Okay. One way in which I like to think of consciousness is, I've heard like sort of different ways of thinking about it, but one way I like to think about it is almost like a flashlight. Okay. You have different sensory information that you're kind of taking in your body, but oftentimes when you think of like these different sensations, like sight is certainly one of the more dominant types of senses that we have. So when we think of our consciousness like a flashlight, we've got to think about it, we think about it as something that kind of like illuminates with a direction. Okay, so when we put a flashlight on something, we can see it. It's very focused. Everything that's dark around it is still there, but it's maybe just not illuminated by what is the light. So that's one way to kind of think of consciousness, or your conscious awareness, where you're kind of putting your conscious awareness. Okay. So what that means in movement is, what are we actually focusing on when we are moving? And a lot of the times the battle I think that goes on is when we have maybe too much information at our disposal. Sometimes we can be very analytical in terms of what we're doing. We can try to think of a movement and we can break it down into a lot of detail. We can look at it from, say, like these different lenses that we were talking about it. We can look at it from, say, like a joint by joint perspective, and we can analyze each individual joint, and we can say, okay, what's happening at each individual joint, what's kind of going on, all these different things. And obviously to some extent your brain is already doing that, and if you potentially put too much of your consciousness into that, you kind of you sort of lose the essence or the idea of what it is that you're trying to do in terms of the overall movements. You know, movements can't be just analyzed like that all the time, where we say, okay, we have to focus on our ankle for this sort of movements, while these sort of joints and these sort of things are present within a lot of movements that we do. If we have that analytical nature all the time, where we're looking at the joints and exactly what's going on, all that sort of stuff, it can kind of become too much for the system in terms of your focus and what you're doing. And you, as I said, you sort of lose what's going on. So this is kind of one end of the spectrum, where you might think of it as sort of information overload. And I'm sure we've all been in states like this, whether it be during movement or just other times, where you're just taking in way too much information for what's sort of the simple task potentially in front of you. And this can be to our detriment sometimes. There's also the opposite end then. There's a stage or a state of kind of taking in maybe too little information. And by taking in too little information, it's kind of like almost like something is kind of performed lazily, or maybe just with not enough attentiveness to be completed or executed in a correct manner. So you've got these kind of two sides. And where we want to lie in is sort of like this middle point, okay? I can't think of who actually kind of stipulated this or put together this theory, but there's this model called the zone of proximal development, and it's more thinking about it from the state of how we actually make progress in what we do, okay? And this is sort of thinking about it from maybe a learning perspective, where you would say, okay, if you have way too much information, it can kind of be daunting, it can kind of be overwhelming. This isn't necessarily, as I said, thinking about it more in the movement perspective, but thinking about it more maybe in the progress and learning, which is, I suppose, when you think about it, movement is going to be that sort of well-rounded learning experience. So when we have too much information, this is kind of like one end of the spectrum, where there's just so much that we almost get anxious, we overanalyze, and we kind of get caught up so much in all the information that we maybe don't get to act as efficiently as possible. And then, as I said, the opposite side, too little information. It's almost in that sense, when too little information is being taken in, you can almost guarantee that there's some sense of boredom that's going on. Maybe there's just not enough being given, and you lose interest very quick in those sort of states. So the zone of proximal development is like kind of that optimal level of arousal that kind of sits in the middle. this would be the point, that zone of proximal development, where you're getting enough information that you're able to sort of, it's complex enough. It's meeting you where you're at in terms of your own kind of understanding, and that's certainly a big point of this sort of model as well. Is people are going to be at different states. I present something to one person, and it's a new thing that's just outside their kind of understanding, and it's going to be really, really interesting for them to sort of dive into. But if I were to explain this to someone who has already heard of the zone of proximal development, there's a certain point where I'm going to lose that person in terms of their understanding, because they're kind of like, yeah, I already understand this, I already know what's going on. If they're an expert in it, for example, that's going to be certainly a person who's maybe just going to be on that low arousal state. And then obviously if there's someone who this is just way too advanced for them, they've never really pondered this sort of stuff, or they've not even moved a day in their life, that's just going to be way too much information for them to sort of digest and go with. Okay, so that's what we want to think about, is we want to kind of find ourselves in that sort of optimal state of arousal a lot of the time, that zone of proximal development. Okay, so what does this mean then when it comes to actual sort of conscious awareness while we're moving? It's an important thing to then think of, is what's the sort of optimal state that we would find ourselves in terms of the zone of proximal development, where we're kind of optimally aroused and stimulated and ready to kind of soak up a lot of information and make a lot of progress, putting ourselves in that zone. Okay, so with conscious awareness, I think one of the faults is we probably assume to some degree that we're already doing it. Excuse me. We almost assume when we go into a movement task, no matter how complex it is, we kind of assume to some degree that we're conscious and that we're focused in on what we're doing. But oftentimes when we sort of go through this, you might find yourself just finishing a movement task and you just kind of go, wait, what was I even doing there? Was I really analyzing and sort of focusing in on what I should be doing? One thing that often comes to mind when I think about this idea is when I was working in a commercial gym, there was a section of the gym, or at least all the sections almost, had TVs in them. Like any time you turned a corner or turned at an angle in the gym, you'd find a TV in your line of sight. There was a line of treadmills that you would find, and like there was 3 or 4 different TVs. The treadmills themselves had TVs on the monitors that you could activate and sort of go and go through on different channels. Even in the main gym area, or what would have been the weight section, there was multiple TVs spread out, so you could never not be looking at a TV. Do you know what I mean? And it was so interesting for me to kind of see this, because I had come from more of a strength style gym, where it would have been open pan, lots more equipment available in terms of, say, like resistance options and stuff like that, which I loved. Like that was the perfect thing for me, because with a heavy focus on strength training at the time, that's what I wanted to see. So going from that was the gym that I trained in, but then the gym that I worked in was this sort of commercialized, really high-end sort of gym. And I found that so interesting, because I was always in this state of kind of looking at different people and going you're not even conscious right now. You're not really thinking about what you're doing when it comes to the training. Certainly on a treadmill, don't get me wrong. Sometimes if you're going for just a bit of cardio, for someone who's just walking and getting in the kilometers, by all means, there's not much sort of cognitive or conscious awareness that you need to hold in a situation like that. But certainly when you're thinking of a lot of, say, the more complex movements that you might do in a gym, whether they be strength movements, or with dumbbells, barbells, whatever it is, I just always found it so funny that there could be so much of your attention put towards the movements that you're doing, analyzing them, trying to see, okay, what do I need to adjust the next time I go to do a movement to really better your training. But people were just straight away eyes on a TV, and it's almost kind of like the environment was sort of creating that. Do you know what I mean? It's it's not people's fault that the TVs were there. It's kind of down to the way in which the gym was organized. It felt silly, it's just eyes on the TV and you're sort of brainless to what's going on. So that's certainly one way in which I've looked at it as okay, there needs to be certainly some sort of a directive sort of input with your consciousness, your conscious awareness, when you're doing stuff. And I say conscious awareness because I do want you to think of it as that kind of flashlight. We would say that we're conscious and that we're sort of going about our things, but where is our actual awareness? What are we focused on when we're sort of performing, executing, going through a movement task? So as I said there, we kind of assume what the fault is really is that we kind of assume that we already have it. It seems so simple, it seems like such an easy concept when I say it to people. This is kind of one of the harder things that I can find to communicate, that I communicate to students and people that work with me, is I really want you to kind of analyze what it is that you're doing, where your thoughts are, and what your sort of mindset is potentially around, like, say, like what you're doing. Because there's a lot of learnings to kind of happen for that, not only in terms of the movement itself, in terms of execution, but even then kind of like states of being, how you're feeling around, say, like the planned session that you had, and then how that kind of filters in terms of your execution of a movement potentially. So there's that general awareness that you could have sort of in the training session itself, but then there's that kind of conscious awareness, that flashlight type awareness that you could have in terms of the movements that you're going through. And that's gonna show a lot of stuff. Like, that sort of heightened level of awareness is really gonna help you with, say, the identification of limitations, like limitations to what's sort of holding you back in terms of how you execute the task at hand. You'd look at it in terms of, say, like if something is a lower body dominant movement, whatever way it is, you're sort of analyzing to some degree, okay, well, where is the limitation? As I said, that kind of look at potentially like the joints in terms of what's going on. But then you could look at it from sort of the overall structure. It's like, where am I holding tension? Where am I not holding tension? Where do I potentially need to hold tension in terms of what I'm doing? I find that sort of general level of awareness around what's going on is certainly going to help, but then it can really, that might help at the start in terms of when you're kind of figuring out potentially like a new movement. But as time goes on, like with repetition, your brain is going to figure out a lot of this stuff. But if you have that conscious awareness, that's certainly going to help. Like if you take the two people and separate them and say to one, okay, I want you to really, really focus on what you're doing. You take the other person and you almost overstimulate them. You give them really fast-paced music, and then you also give them a TV in front of them while they're performing it. You can understand then to a certain degree that the person who's got that, overload of stimuli is going to perform the movement probably very poorly, and is going to figure it out at a much slower rate than would be the person who's, say, like not listening to music, really, really focusing on what they're doing and putting their conscious awareness into their body for every single rep that they're going through. And it's certainly going to get better with time. Like, it's the kind of like the process of meditation that you hear a lot of people go on about, where they first start off and the whole idea is to kind of focus in on one thing. That focal point might be your breath, for example. And you find you'll trail off. But it's not necessarily about the idea of you shouldn't trail off. It's when you trail off, what's your ability to kind of bring yourself back to the focal point. So you could have it in a meditation where, like, you stray off your breath a million times, but the focus is, have you brought it back that million times, or can you have that gap, that interval be shorter, say, by the time that you sort of get it back to whatever your focal point is, rather than, say, the novice to meditation that is, they're going to have their conscious awareness on their breath, and then suddenly 5 minutes later they find, like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be meditating, where they've just gone on a trail of thought. So that's sort of something to consider then when it comes to the movements that you're going through, is, are you sort of taking in all the sensory information that's really going on in the body that could be an aid to you figuring something out in a much better way? And you can kind of find those faults to what you're performing, or even obviously areas that are sort of really going well with the movement task that you're trying to perform. So this is certainly something to consider. It's certainly that way of sort of getting us into that zone of proximal development that I discussed at the start, where you're gonna find yourself in a better state, certainly, and then maybe over time, like as I said there at the start of performing a movement, repetition really is probably going to get you to majority of the way there. But you've got that conscious awareness that's certainly going to build and build over time. But then as you perform something, maybe in time, let's say you've performed lots and lots of repetitions, but there's potentially areas that are still there's areas within the your nervous system's way of kind of figuring out that still need to be fine-tuned. The last little bit of a task needs to be just refined a little bit. That's certainly where conscious awareness is going to be a massive benefit for you. Really, really focusing in on, say, okay, how am I feeling around sort of the area that needs to move or not move, whatever it is, and that's definitely going to bring about a lot more than, as I said, that idea of the person who has not had much conscious awareness to what they're doing. And sometimes obviously we find ourselves in that state, and it's unfortunate when we do, because we're certainly going to find that our speed, our rate of progress is going to be slowed down. It's going to be halted. It's going to be hindered in some way by that lack of conscious awareness. And as I said, this is something that I certainly try to bring into a lot of the people that I work with. Just basic things that you can sort of analyze and sort of think about when you're going through movement tasks. And maybe this is a more practical thing to now try when you go to perform a movement task now in the future. You can just sort of pose these questions to yourself almost as you're performing it as well, or potentially after you've performed the movement. Was I happy with the speed? For example, like, could the speed actually be to your detriment? Could the speed be something that you potentially need to play around with? You either need to bring the speed back to the point that you're performing it with a lot more accuracy, because sometimes that level of speed can really affect maybe the accuracy or the specific way in which you should be performing a movement. Speed is potentially something that might be developed at a later stage. It's the best way that I like to think of it, is speed really comes at a later stage when you've really got that level of control. So when you slow things down, that's really going to help. Obviously, to a certain degree, there's certain movements that you might find will need to be performed with a little bit of momentum. So speed is actually going to make things worse if it's used in that context. But once again, you're only going to get that by that level of conscious awareness to what is kind of going on, what the movement is and how you should be performing it. So that's certainly a question to kind of come into it, is the speed. And then obviously tied to that maybe is the level of control. Then you can start maybe asking questions like more about the physiological structure. Maybe, am I strong enough to perform this movement task? And it's not that you should necessarily strip back and say, okay, I can't perform this because I'm not strong enough. It's what adjustment can I make to make things more accessible for me right now, so that I can progress and advance with this variation to then bring it forward in my training. So certainly these questions, these are things that will come up over time that you'll find yourself sort of naturally asking. But as long as you go into each movement and kind of say to yourself, okay, let go of all distractions. You'll sometimes we naturally find ourselves in doing this when it's a repeated movement over time. Like, I think, for example, sports like I've done Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the past, and I've certainly found myself very conscious of what's going on during a movement like that. You've got someone else that is trying to kind of obviously get you into a certain position, potentially put you in a choke, a lock, or something like that. So you're certainly aware of what's going on. Like, you're in a fight at the end of the day. That's what you're in. So that's certainly something that is like guaranteed to bring you conscious as hell, like really aware to what you're doing. So that's something we maybe need to take into what we're doing then when it's tasks that maybe don't have that level of facilitation, where something has facilitated your conscious awareness. Like that idea there of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is it really brings you into the moment because you are in a fight. So how can you bring that level of awareness into what you're doing when it's outside that area, when it's just something very basic, but it's obviously something that's going to give you value. So how can you really bring in that really heightened level of awareness, that conscious awareness, that sort of flashlight consciousness or conscious awareness to the situation? So certainly a lot to consider there. I'm not sure what the time is exactly, but hopefully there's enough to sort of digest and play with there, and in terms of practical application as well. It's something to take into whatever you're doing, your practice, the movements that you're doing. Something to consider certainly as you go forward is, what are you doing with your consciousness? Where is it directed? Could it improve? Could you be better in terms of what you're doing when it comes to the movements that you're performing? Because I see it time and time again. I think it's something that does come up an awful lot, is kind of that distracted consciousness that can come into the movements that we're performing, and it almost seems as if it's an extra burden on top of what we're doing in terms of our sort of daily tasks. Like, we have so much of our cognitive energy being pulled to so many different things. So when it comes to our movement, it almost seems as if we should have something that just kind of like, oh, well, I shouldn't have to think about it in some sense. But I get that. So like, sometimes you certainly do want to just sort of dissipate and sort of let go of things, and that's sort of necessary to a certain degree. But other times, definitely that level of consciousness to sort of figure things out and see yourself making progress. That's where this level of conscious awareness is certainly relevant. So certainly consider it. One thing I wanted to say as well is, as time has gone on, I certainly want to make sure that people are aware of what it is that I do in terms of, say, my offerings to other people. Like I've obviously mentioned on this podcast, and you've probably seen on my page, whether it's through Instagram or previous episodes of the podcast, I've talked about this idea of, like, say, clients, students, people working with me. I basically am going to do this potentially, say, like once every month, where I'm just going to sort of open up my books, where I am available to take on, say, like new students, new people. And I'll probably only ever open it up like once a month, just to obviously make sure that I have the, say, availability. And obviously I want the people to be the right people, so I'll only ever open up kind of, say, like potentially one spot at a time, just to make sure that as people are kind of coming on to work with me, that they are being given the adequate time in sort of the onboarding process, and just making sure that they're okay with the systems, the way things work and stuff like that. So if any of these episodes have previously interested, or if you've kind of sat on the sidelines before watching say some of my content, the things that I do, and you've been interested, certainly take this as an opportunity to reach out. What I'm going to do is, as I said, I'm just going to do this potentially once a month, where I just sort of open up some availability in my diary, just to potentially take on a few calls, but I'll probably only take out on one person at a time, where you're gonna, as I said, come on to this kind of system, this way of thinking, this more in-depth way of sort of training and looking at things. And where I've directed in the past certainly has been more towards, say, like the strength and conditioning side of things. Like, it is certainly a area of expertise that I hold when it comes to sort of training. But as time has gone on, I've had this more, say, dynamic, expansive look at sort of what is training and maybe movement, as it would be called, certainly within the past year in terms of my studies. But then it comes down to sort of where I see myself applying it going forward as well. So obviously I have my own directed training, is the way I want to think of it, and my role in some sense as, like, say, a teacher to my students, or a practitioner in my own right, is to continue to explore in terms of my own stuff, and then develop and sort of identify these, say, steps within the process, whether they be in something more complex or more simple. Like, I've certainly got my viewpoint, and my lens has been through resistance training, mainly, as I said, and strength and conditioning. So that lens certainly has shaped a lot of my processes and ways of doing things, and sort of more the programming side of things that I do with my what would have been sort of more athletes and clients. Whereas now I certainly have those people that are working forward with me, and they've been involved in this process over time of me sort of adapting and changing my systems, my ways of looking at the body, how the materials that I'm giving them. And I always want to make sure that when I'm giving those materials, kind of, I've been through the process myself, I need to make sure that my understanding is to a point where nothing is being lost. You know, I can certainly understand when people maybe jump the gun in terms of what they do, where they haven't gone through the process themselves potentially, or they haven't spent enough time, maybe they haven't gone in depth enough, they haven't really put it into practice a lot, and something kind of gets lost. It's almost as if there isn't enough, like this process of, say, like thinking of it as skin in the game. They haven't really developed enough, say, like a simple, maybe more simple way is they haven't developed or gone through the repetitions. They just haven't put enough time into sort of diving into a certain area and exploring it to the point that what they give back isn't good enough. You know, it's not digestible for the people that are kind of trying to learn from them. So that's certainly my process in terms of what I'm doing and going about things. Is I'm trying to almost think of it as my own research, my own delving into these different areas, and it's going to change certainly over time. And what then my students is the way I'm sort of thinking of it now, more as opposed to say like my clients, athletes and stuff like that. Is the kind of coach client relationship for me certainly brings this whole thing of it's almost like an expectation of you're going to do the work for me. And that's certainly the way I felt when I was working as a personal trainer in person with people. Is like, there's the way I think of it is no, the work is being done by you. Like, I'm just the one that provides the work at the end of the day. Like, I certainly will be there as a sounding board for a lot of the issues that you have, and I leave myself open to be contacted by my clients at the time, and I'm always there to help them. But sometimes that sort of coach-client relationship implies that level of, okay, you're gonna be my sort of helping hand and almost do everything for me. Whereas I suppose teacher-student means that, okay, I'm a provider of the material. I've gone through the process itself, and I have a deeper understanding currently. I'm just further along the journey, almost, as a way to think of it. And that implies then, okay, like, you're the student. Learn, like, soak up the information, ask the questions that are relevant for you to get an understanding of this, so you can almost apply it yourself going forward. Like, I want to see that progress within the people that I end up working with. So that's certainly something to consider, is going forward. That's my relationship that I want to have with, say, the people that work with me. And I say that in the sense that I want them to work with me in that way of, I'm delving I'm delving deeper into these areas. I'm putting together these processes, systems, and when I give them to my students and the people that work with me, is there's that level of feedback. There's a loop there in terms of, okay, I'm getting an idea of, okay, how does this actually work when it was presented to them? There's a bit of feedback. There's that sort of reinforcement there. Is, okay, what direction should we go? How do I help this person get a better understanding in that way? And that will certainly grow. So that's the intention with what I do. So if there have been areas, if there have been things that you've been sort of wanting to work on, wanting to expand into, wanting to grow into, whether it be on the sort of obviously physical training side of things, whether it be obviously as an athlete involved in a sport and you want to just get that sort of outside perspective, that's certainly what I can offer. But as I said, the idea here is to put this information out, for me to kind of say this maybe potentially once a month of people that potentially want to work with me, but just contact me. I'll leave details certainly in terms of how to get in touch with me. The email that I send out will have that I'll send this private podcast out to will have an application form. All you have to do is fill in your information and just let me know sometimes that might suit for a call, and I'll get back to you with an email, and we'll just try and organize something for, as soon as possible, just so that we can jump on the phone, have a chat about sort of like where things are at currently with yourself and what you're doing and what you want to work on, all that sort of stuff. And as I said, it's that idea of, okay, we're going into a relationship going forward that is going to be mutually beneficial. I'm just further along the journey in some way, and you're working with me to get a better understanding of kind of my processes, my ways of looking at things, and I'll give you as much information as you sort of need from there. But as I said, from the more, that's that sort of teacher-student relationship that might be a better way to think about it, as opposed to that sort of coach-client where you're almost expecting me to do everything yourself, and there's no there's almost no responsibility taken for the work that you're supposed to do yourself, whether it be the physical training or the kind of the expansion further into other things. I'll cut it at that. Hopefully that wasn't too long extended onto the end of the actual material of the podcast itself. Really enjoying this so far, folks. I hope you are too. And as I said, there's an opportunity there to ask me a lot of questions when it comes to the podcast that I can answer and go into a lot more detail. And so if there are questions, respond to this email. If you're potentially interested in working with me, just fill in that application form that I have sent out along with this link to the podcast, and I'd be really excited to just jump on a call and chat through things. But for the moment, folks, that was, I think it was episode 5, not too sure, but that was looking at conscious awareness when we move. All right, all the best, folks, and I'll see you soon.